Let's delve into the intriguing yet often misunderstood world of the quadroon balls, a historical phenomenon that has resurfaced in conversations about race and social dynamics. Originating from 19th century New Orleans, these events were cloaked in both allure and controversy, revealing the complexities of race relations in America. The term quadroon, famously popularized by President Thomas Jefferson, referred to individuals of mixed ancestry, specifically those with one-quarter African heritage. This classification, created within a slaveholding context, highlights the oppressive environment where racial identity determines societal fate. Jefferson, although a figure in American history, was paradoxically a slaveholder who never liberated his own mixed-race children. Amid this backdrop, the quadroon balls were marketed as exclusive events where wealthy white men could mingle with women of color, often depicted through romanticized and sexualized lenses. Yet, as we dig deeper into historical evidence, the image of the quadroon ball begins to shatter. The existence of an 1858 advertisement announcing a quadroon ball serves as our first tangible proof of these events. Initially, it struck me more as a figment of Southern fantasies than a real social practice. The imagery often conjured by these historical accounts portrays women of color in desperate need, eager to impress, and ultimately, to forge relationships with their white counterparts. In the rich tapestry of Louisiana's history, we see the emergence of a practice known as Plage. This involved women of color attending extravagant balls with the hope of forming legally binding relationships with affluent white men. Unlike modern-day relationships, these agreements were structured and secured in the presence of notaries, setting clear terms for emotional and financial commitments. A woman involved would often receive housing and income, allowing her and her children to thrive, especially in a landscape where interracial marriages were strictly prohibited. The status of free women of color in Louisiana was far from subordinate. They were formidable figures who owned land, businesses, and even slaves. This affluence did not simply fall into their laps. It was a result of careful navigation of their societal circumstances. Interestingly, while Plage relationships provided certain securities, they were not universally sought after or admired among the wealthy Creole and free black elite. As we move into the late 1850s, the atmosphere in Louisiana shifted dramatically. The impending Civil War hung over the region like a dark cloud, where freedom was under constant threat. 1858 brought about more stringent regulations for free people of color. Curfews were instated, and their movements were heavily restricted. In fact, groups of white inhabitants launched violent attacks against free people of color, further worsening an already precarious situation. Legislative efforts emerged with alarming proposals that sought to re-enslave free individuals and seize their belongings. Transitioning from societal patterns, let's take a closer look at where many of these historic dances and interactions unfolded. The Globe, once a famous gambling establishment near the docks of New Orleans, was notorious for attracting a mix of revelers, including Creoles and free people of color. Before the Louisiana Purchase, the social fabric of the city allowed individuals from various backgrounds to intermingle, forming connections at local dances, churches, and dining establishments like the Café des Refugees. Post-acquisition, Americans sought to impose rigid racial boundaries that directly contradicted the previously established cultural dynamics of the area. This unraveling did not erase the complexity and richness of Louisiana's social landscape. Ironically, despite these strictures, Louisiana remains a place where the interplay of race and culture continues to create intricate identities, a phenomenon still resonant today. Fast forward to 1860, and we observe a prosperous community of Creoles and free people of color thriving as homeowners and entrepreneurs, collectively valued at a staggering $15 million. These families weren't simply working class. Many possessed high levels of education, earning degrees from prestigious institutions abroad. It's essential to note that individuals of such status would never subject their daughters to dubious environments like dance halls filled with strangers. In the 1790s, slaveholders in New Orleans expressed fierce opposition to any attempts to limit slave attendance at dances frequented by white colonials and free men of color. The logic was stark. They understood that slave women could earn far more in the sex trade than any other labor. Legal cases that emerged in the Louisiana Supreme Court even indicated that some slaveholders engaged in the abhorrent practice of leasing out slave women for prostitution during these gatherings, a grim reminder of the brutal realities of the time. Fast forward just a couple of years before this ball to a speech delivered in the U.S. Senate by Charles Sumner. Known as the crime against Kansas, it was bold and confrontational. Sumner denounced actions taken by Senator Butler of South Carolina, asserting that the Kansas-Nebraska Act was not merely about statehood, but an attempt to preserve and promote the institution of slavery. His grave accusation? That white slaveholders were intent on perpetuating a legacy of sexual violence against slave women. This speech sparked a violent reaction from Butler's cousin, Congressman Preston Brooks, who brutally attacked Sumner. The assault captured the growing tensions of the era and laid bare the violent realities of slavery, including the all-too-common horrors of sexual exploitation. The quadroon balls, once whispered about in the shadowed alleys and lavish parlors of 19th-century New Orleans, were events steeped in both allure and unease. Beneath their opulent surface lay complex tensions, racial, social, and personal, that simmered just out of sight. These gatherings, exclusive yet infamous, were where beauty, ambition, and exploitation collided in an unsettling dance. Inside, the ballroom was a spectacle of decadence. Vast mirrors lined the walls, endlessly reflecting the glow of 100 flickering candelabras. The scent of jasmine and exotic spices wafted through the air, mingling with the faint traces of aged cognac and mischief. Women in gowns of shimmering silk floated across the polished wooden floor, their laughter a delicate veil over their apprehension. They were quadroons, women of one-quarter African descent, selected not just for their beauty but for their poise and charm, groomed to enter into Plage arrangements with wealthy white men. These alliances promised comfort and luxury, but came at the cost of freedom and agency. The men, dressed in finely tailored evening coats and masks that concealed their intentions as much as their faces, moved like predators through the room. Their eyes lingered on the women with an unnerving mix of admiration and calculation. This was a market as much as a ball, and every waltz carried the weight of unspoken negotiations. The quadroon balls had profound social implications, reflecting and reinforcing the racial and gender hierarchies of 19th-century New Orleans. These events were emblematic of the complex and often exploitative relationships between white men and women of mixed race, particularly within the system of Plage. Here are some key social implications. Racial hierarchies. The balls highlighted the rigid racial stratification of the time. While quadroons were often celebrated for their beauty and charm, they were also objectified and commodified, existing in a liminal space between privilege and oppression. Their participation in these events underscored their exclusion from full societal acceptance. Gender dynamics. The quadroon balls reinforced patriarchal norms, as women were often groomed and presented as potential companions for wealthy white men. These arrangements, while offering some financial security, came at the cost of autonomy and were rooted in a system that prioritized male power and control. Economic opportunities and limitations. For some women of color, these events provided a pathway to economic stability and social mobility through relationships with affluent men. However, this came with significant limitations, as their roles were often confined to that of a mistress or concubine, rather than an equal partner. Moral and ethical debates. The quadroon balls sparked debates about morality, consent, and exploitation. While some viewed them as a pragmatic response to the constraints of the time, others criticized them as perpetuating systemic inequalities and the objectification of women. The racial hierarchies in 19th-century New Orleans were deeply complex, shaped by the city's unique colonial history under French and Spanish rule, and later influenced by American racial ideologies. Here's a closer look at how these hierarchies were structured. Tripartite racial structure. Unlike the binary racial system prevalent in much of the United States, New Orleans had a tripartite system. This included white Europeans. At the top of the hierarchy, they held political, economic, and social power. Free people of color, gens de couleur libres. This group occupied a middle tier. Many were of mixed African and European ancestry and enjoyed certain privileges, such as owning property, receiving education, and working in skilled professions. However, their status was precarious and subject to change, especially as American racial attitudes became more dominant. Enslaved Africans and African Americans, at the bottom of the hierarchy, they were subjected to forced labor, violence, and systemic oppression. Creole identity and colorism. Within the free people of color, lighter skin tones often conferred higher social status, a legacy of colonial attitudes. Creoles of color, born in Louisiana and often of mixed heritage, were sometimes distinguished from darker-skinned individuals or those born in Africa. Impact of Plage. The system of Plage, where white men entered into formalized relationships with women of color, further complicated these hierarchies. While these arrangements could provide economic benefits and social mobility for women and their children, they also reinforced the objectification and commodification of women of color. Shift under American rule. After the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, American racial ideologies began to erode the relative fluidity of the French and Spanish systems. Laws and social norms increasingly restricted the rights of free people of color, pushing them closer to the status of enslaved individuals. The quadroon ball had become an almost mythic event in the 19th century New Orleans social calendar, a night of shimmering decadence, whispered aspirations, and shadowy secrets. It was said that beneath the splendor of the chandeliers and the intoxicating melodies of violins, spirits lingered. For some, the ballroom was a stage for life-altering negotiations. For others, it was a battleground of the past and present, haunted by what could never be undone. My name is Penny Flick, with Kreep-ish. I'll be back with more stories that challenge our perceptions, question reality, and keep us peering into the darkness of history. Comment below on your thoughts. What stories intrigue you the most? What mysteries do you want to uncover? Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and remember, the truth is often stranger than fiction.